Okay, this is a History 1301 lecture on the next group or groups of settlers into North America, and those are the Virginia Cavaliers, and if time permits, the Quakers of Pennsylvania. So we begin with the Virginia Cavaliers today. The Virginia Cavaliers are going to settle along the Chesapeake Bay region of Virginia and what is also known as the Tidewater. And the Virginia Cavaliers themselves, they are coming to North America for very different reasons than our previous group of English-speaking settlers, and that would be the Puritans. The Puritans came for religious reasons, ultimately. They came to create a better life for themselves, more particularly in the form of religious liberty, to practice their religion and set up a colony as they saw fit. Not, as I've said, not to create a religious liberty haven for all, but for themselves. Anyways, the Cavaliers of Virginia are not here to create a religious liberty haven. They are religious in their own way, but the Cavaliers of Virginia, they are far more interested in creating a new England, a reconstitution of England that they had over on the other side of the ocean and bring it over to the Tidewater. Many of the young men and their servants who are going to come to what we'll call Virginia, the Tidewater, the Chesapeake Bay region, they are the aristocrats. They are the second and third born sons of elites in Virginia, or elites in England, excuse me, a royalist, in fact. They really come in numbers in the 1650s and so. The thing is that these Cavaliers are going to come partially because they and their kinsmen are going to have locked up in a civil war with the Puritan Roundheads, led by Oliver Cromwell, and it goes poorly for the Royalists. In fact, Charles I always get my Charleses back mixed up, and I still may have, just me going off the top of my head. But King Charles loses his head over the issue. There's regicide, and Oliver Cromwell becomes a Lord Protector of England, Scotland, and so forth. So there was some animosity between the Puritans and the Virginians, or the Cavaliers, and that's part of the reason you'll have this migration. But it seems to be the greater impetus to come to North America and to set up along the Tidewater, the Chesapeake Bay region of Virginia, was the fact that for the second and third born sons, this was an opportunity to set themselves up and to create a new life for themselves. They're not here for religion. They're here for money. Well, the Cavaliers get their name. The Virginia Cavaliers get their name because of the styles that they wore. And so one of the things you'll notice what I'm doing with all these four major groups of English-speaking or Anglo settlers or to the American colonies or the English-speaking colonies is that I'm kind of setting them up and explaining to you how they are different compared to the other groups. The Cavaliers, they dressed in a haughty style. That's literally the reason they're called the Cavaliers is because of their kind of head cocked back, devil-may-care, and certainly their fashion dress. Now, I'm pulling on a Dickies work shirt. That's not what they wore. But they wore frills and cuffs. They wore loud and brash colors, very cavalier and very devil-may-care style of clothing. And to the Puritans, who had earth tones and very much a modest and non-severe clothing, it seemed off the charts wrong. Perhaps theologically, but certainly fashionably, those two could not be more different. And so that's where the name Cavalier comes from. As I've already said, they are here as royalists. They are here as elites. They're not middle class. They're not merchant class like the Puritans were. And they are going to bring with them initially, at least in the first waves of settlers, they are not coming to North America to bring up a family, at least not initially. They're coming to North America to set up shop, and so they bring with them servants. And eventually those indentured servants become slaves, and really the introduction of slavery as we understand it in North America, and especially in American history, takes place because of the Cavaliers of Virginia and also the settlers in South Carolina and Georgia, but especially South Carolina. But the slaves that will be introduced along the Chesapeake to work the farms and plantations there are going to replace indentured servants. So really where I'm going with this is you have the elites on the top end and you have the servants on the bottom end, and those indentured servants would often work a term of about 7 7 or 10 years before they are released of their condition of servitude, and they themselves oftentimes would either buy slaves, buy land, or become themselves, get servants for themselves. Kind of the idea to move up in the world. Anyways, the territory is extraordinarily fertile, and that's really one of the things to keep in mind. It is extraordinarily fertile, and it's a good place in the 16 and 1700s to grow crop. It is also one of the Chesapeake Bay region is one of the great fisheries in all of the world, let alone North America. And unlike the Puritans, who had great hang-ups and did not particularly care for fish except for when they were starving, the folks along the Chesapeake had no such compunction. They never had a canonical dish where you could look around and say, that is a religious dish for them. Not so, not so. So they would eat whatever they could get their hands on. And I say that not quite literally, but at the same time, they would eat fish and loved it. And so to this day, if you go to Washington, D.C., which is on a tidal river that feeds into the Chesapeake, and it's right down the road from the Chesapeake Bay. The tidal river is, of course, the Potomac. Or you go to Baltimore or some of the other towns and cities that line the jagged coast of, the jagged meaning just in and out, inlet cuts and such, of the Chesapeake, you will find fantastic seafood. My personal favorite is Maryland crabs and Maryland scallops. But you find all of that wonderful seafood, and they talked about in the early days, and this is not necessarily unique to the Chesapeake. You found it actually in Mobile Bay and in Louisiana and Texas and other places as well. But when they pulled the oysters out, they weren't little small oysters that some of you like to eat, and I like to eat. They pulled out these oysters that were about as big as a steak, and that you would pull out the muscle, and you would almost have to cut it and eat it in sections rather than just one gulp of crackers like we do today. So fantastic seafood. So hopefully if you're watching this, it's not at lunchtime, and if it is, well, maybe you can go get something to eat or make something in the kitchen. I'm not making you too hungry. But these folks never had hang-ups about food. And beyond the seafood, they would eat steaks, not necessarily quite cooked the same way that we did it over here in 2020, but at the same time, they ate beef, they ate pork, they ate a lot of different foods, and they enjoyed it. Food was kind of an indulgence of theirs. They would really enjoy food. They never had the same religious hang-ups as the Puritans. It's not to say they're not religious. So I think it's fair to remember for these fellas, they are Anglicans. They are Anglicans, meaning Church of England. They would have been strongly in the tradition of Henry VIII. They would have detested religious fanaticism that you found in the Puritans. They would have found that dangerous, and at least dangerous and off-putting. Of course, it cost the king his head, and so forth. So these folks are religious, but they are not fanatical. But as we go on, we talked about in the previous lecture of the Puritans about their mating practices. I say make it sound like we're in a Discovery Channel here. But when we talk about the dating and mating practices of the Cavaliers, and marriage practices of the Cavaliers, it is very different. It is very different than that of the Puritans. The Puritans believed in essence in a love match and in some form of crude equality between the sexes. Clearly, in Puritan society, the male was dominant to the female, but it wasn't just this is the male at the top and the female somewhere below the screen. The fact of the matter is that in Virginia society, that was the case. This is a male-dominated society, and women are far down on the pecking order. And so how does one go about getting married in Virginia society? Well, first of all, you don't get married in a love match. You don't go looking for that soulmate. The term soulmate is certainly a modern concoction. But even by the time periods, the Cavaliers could be quite, I guess you could say, quite cold-blooded about the thing. They did not believe in marrying for love, at least not in a major sense. And these Cavaliers were really big in making lists. And one of the lists that's out there that survived in time shows, reasons for getting married. And down on about number 4 or 5 is going to be love. They thought it was a good development and a happy development of a marriage if the spouses fell in love with each other and they came to like each other. But you might marry for position, you might marry for superficial reasons, you might marry for religious reasons, but getting married for love, like number 4 or 5 on the list. So that could cause some problems in the marriage. Number 2, These aren't arranged marriages, but they're not going to go chasing after somebody who is not in their class and caste. They are going to marry within the Cavalier circles. And so all these great families like the Carters and the Lees and the Washingtons and so forth, they are inveterate lovers of genealogies. And they all know each other's genealogy because they're in a sense all related to each other. By the time you get to the American Revolution in 1775, some of those families had been in the Tidewater for 140 years. And so I'm not saying they're all inbred, but at the same time, there was a whole lot of close connections. It was, in a sense, a closed society. You couldn't marry, in a sense, you could not marry your way into it. You had to be born into it. The idea of social mobility in this group was very much lacking compared to some of the others in the more general American experience. But they are going to set up shop and they are going to get married. And something else to keep in mind, too, is that the typical Virginian waited till he got married. And they're Anglican. And so as you should remember, as I have said to you before, the Anglicans are going to treat marriage much more, not seriously. The Puritans treated it seriously. They just did it on a civil level. But the Cavaliers are going to treat, because they are Anglican, the Cavaliers are going to treat marriage much more like the Catholic Church, and they're going to consider it a sacrament. Remember, the Anglican Church has many of the same trappings and practices, rites and habits of the Catholic Church. Obviously, the head of the church is a major change, and there's some other ones that come along too. But the Anglican Church venerates marriage as a sacrament, and so therefore, if it is like the Catholic Church, and it is, divorce is not okay, and it's just simply not allowed. And so once you're married, you're married. You can't go off and get a divorce. That's just not the way it works. In fact, actually, really, divorce was only allowed and reserved for the king, and only, in a sense, Henry VIII anyways. Other kings, generally speaking, do not get married, or they stay married and just have mistresses on the side. That was an understood thing. But at the same time, marriage under official English practice for the longest time was a one and done deal. So you're in. Once you got married, you were in. The average male, worth noting here, the average male got married somewhere around the age of 28, 29. That should be interesting to you, because that's essentially the age of the American male today. Sometimes you'll see it as low as 26 or 7, but still mid to late 20s is my point for the average male in Anglican society. But opposite of that, if you think about it, so in the Puritan camp, it was teenagers, and there was a real parity in ages for those males and females in Puritan society getting married for the most part. But in Anglican society, Cavalier society, which are synonymous terms, it's not. The males are much older, 27, 28, 29 territory. The females are somewhere around 18, 19, 20. So there is about an 8 to 10 year gap between the male and the female. Now, why is that? It is a double standard. There's no two ways to describe this. And so, you may grind an axe and say, oh my gosh, this is horrible. They should have been more equality-minded, and sure they should have, but that's not the way cultures sometimes work. That's just not the way they grow up. It is what it is. Sometimes you just have to live with the history, I guess. You don't have to celebrate it, but you just have to say, yeah, that's what they did. And in the case here with the Cavaliers, what they would do is that the men, it was expected, or certainly allowed, maybe a better way to say it, it was allowed for the men to be sexually aggressive, to go off on conquest and such. And I don't mean that in the war-making sense, though there is a warrior ethos with the Cavaliers. But the idea of a Cavalier man having a girlfriend or 2 or 3 or liaisons in his 20s is may not be smiled upon, but it's certainly not overly discouraged. It's just kind of one of those, men will be men sort of thing. And it was expected. In fact, actually, when a married man, a married Cavalier, had himself some dalliances and peccadillos, again, it was, here's the treatment, basically. A very gentle slap on the wrist, probably a reprimand. Don't do that. Come on, buddy. If a female waited till she was late in life or later to get married, that was severely frowned upon in society. And also on top of that, if she was married and she took up and had a boyfriend or two on the side, of course, no divorces, that's what I keep saying, it would be whack. And more particularly, a very good chance she's going to be thrown in the pokey, meaning she's going to be thrown in jail for adultery. It's not a double-edged sword. It is just it is simply a double standard for the men versus the women. So as you can imagine, it causes lots of problems. And some of the most tumultuous fights that I've ever read about between a husband and a wife took place with the Cavaliers. I think it'd be worth noting that the Cavalier marriages oftentimes seem to be very bitter and angry and hateful. It would grieve me greatly to be married to my wife and at the same time really never like her and at times hate her and never speak to her. Let me think here a second. The family was the Carter family. I believe it was the Carter family of Alexandria, Virginia. They never spoke to each other to the point where, for a couple years, he and his wife, Mr. and Mrs. Carter, they'd fallen out. He'd had an affair. She was a bitter woman, and long story short is that they spoke to each other not through the normal means of you speaking to your wife or you speaking to your husband face to face. If a servant or a slave was at hand there in the main house there at Alexandria, they would look at each other and then they wanted to speak and they'd look at the slave or the servant and say, tell Mrs. Carter that I'm going to go to into town to Alexandria today. And she's standing right there. And then she would reply in kind back through the slave. And they would just do it. It was a cold, cold relationship. Hateful, frankly, and to the point where they basically were traveling one day. And in fact, actually, the husband, Mr. Carter, I believe his name was John Carter. But anyways, Mr. Carter told his wife, said, honey, let's go take a trip and let's go for a ride. And it was a sullen silence. It was one of those, very loud silences that you may have heard in your lifetime between two spouses. Well, anyways, it wasn't pleasant. And they're riding along the banks of the Chesapeake Bay. There's a road right close to it sort of thing. And then Mr. Carter basically turns the horses and the carriage and points it straight to the Chesapeake. And the horses start to enter the water. And as soon as when they started to swim, the woman, Mrs. Carter, looked over at her husband and says, Mr. Carter, where are we going? And his reply, to hell, madam, to hell. And then she looks back at the water and says, drive on. Any place is better than Virginia. Any place is better than Alexandria. And so all of which is to say is that there can be some really, really tumultuous and hateful and bad marriages, frankly, in there. And so if you think about it, if you were a kid growing up in that household, how hard it would be. That would be bad. And of course, if you were a servant or a slave in that household, that could be horrible for you as well. One of the great faux pas in polite Virginia society was to abuse your servant or slave in public. Note how I said that, in public. And so you could tell kind of how unhappy the wife was if she abused her servants or slaves in public, because that was just simply something you did not do in front of polite people. But it was an indication of a horrible marriage. So another man you need to make note of, the Byrd family, William Byrd particularly. Thankfully, these men were largely, and these women occasionally, but these men were largely educated, and a lot of them kept good diaries. William Byrd, who was governor of Virginia in the early 1700s, from about 1715 to about 1730, was a typical Cavalier male. This man would be found here, there, and everywhere. You just find his fingerprints all over Virginia society in the time period. And by the way, the capital of Virginia in this point in time is the city of Williamsburg. Richmond is established much later. But Williamsburg's his capital, his home, and William Byrd and his wife are going to have a tumultuous relationship like seemingly all Cavaliers do. They will fight, and by the way, you read his diary, and it's just like a rolling soap opera, because you'll read about how he and his wife will fight. They'll get mad at each other. They won't speak for a week or so, and then they make up, and they make up quite vigorously. And then they fight again, and he, in the process, remembers to say his prayers, and then he forgets to say his prayers, and he has one of his girlfriends drops by, and he has a time with her, if you catch my drift, and on I can go. William Byrd was, thankfully, from a historian's perspective, thankfully honest, and so you kind of get a real flavor, at least how the elites of Virginia live and how they act. And it's at the same time, I believe her name was Lucy, was her name, but you can check me on that. But anyways, Bird's wife will also take care of him. And when he gets sick, he was hurting with dysentery. And dysentery is chronic and, in fact, almost explosive diarrhea with blood and pus mixed in. Dysentery was one of the great killers and hurters of men and women in the Tidewater. Dysentery is, memory serves, it's bacterial, and I'd like to say dysentery is gotten by drinking bad water, but it's certainly an element that was far more common in that time period in the 17th century or the 18th century than it is in the 21st century. Well, anyways, dysentery, there's one comment that he makes in his diary. My wife was so kind and gracious to me and she anointed my bum with linseed oil. That was his quote in his diary. She anointed my bum with linseed oil. Because it was raw. Because the thing about dysentery, it literally doesn't nearly kill you, but what it causes is what kills you, in the sense that you have so many evacuations that you basically become dehydrated and die from the dehydration. So that's dysentery in a nutshell. But he was taken care of. And when his wife dies, which is going to bring me to another subject in a second, when his wife dies, he misses her greatly, despite the tumultuous and upsetting at times the relationship they have. Yet later on, you find William Byrd going back to London on business, and in about a 10-day period, it seems like he has met half of London and slept with half of them. I'm being over the top, but I don't have the book in front of me, but I used to read a selection out of a book and out of his diary where you're like, oh my gosh, this guy is busy. But one of the things I just said is that death, I keep saying this woman died or that man died or it's an unhappy place. And in some respects, that's very true because there was so much death around. New England was healthy compared to England. New England, where the Puritans lived, was a great place to be. But if you talk about Cavalier, Virginia, it was an unhealthy place. It was extraordinarily unhealthy and arguably the most unhealthy place in all of English North America, with the probable exception or the possible exception of the islands along the South Carolina coast. That was the killing fields down there particularly. What makes the Tidewater bad is multiple reasons. First of all, the mosquitoes, and that was part of the reason why South Carolina had its issues along the coast. The mosquitoes would just carry you away, and obviously malaria would be a problem, to say the least. Occasionally you'd get yellow fever that far north, but not often. So yellow fever in Virginia was not the problem that malaria was. Mosquitoes are legion in that part of the world. But the bigger issue, and this is oftentimes the case actually in human history, it seems like, and the more I've read, and of course, and I'm recording this in late 2020 or the September of 2020, when we're all kind of half in class and half out of class because of the virus. You learn a lot more about virus and readings and so forth. And one of the things that I've read, and a friend of mine who is in the biomedical field, and he's got a PhD out of UC San Diego, brilliant guy, went to school with some brilliant kids in high school and so on. Anyways, Dr. Mercer, Andrew, said to me, we're talking about history and health and all that, and he said, really what got people to live a lot longer is that when we figured out we needed to drink clean water, and then secondly, when we figured out we needed to take care of and treat and to dispose of properly wastewater and waste off of the human body. You do those two things, you can cut down on a whole lot of misery, and that's certainly true. In Virginia, and in Tidewater, Virginia, they had what was called the sick season. And the sick season is from essentially July to about October. And the reason it is that long period of time is what you find is that the tidal rivers where they got a lot of their water, or the tidal creeks, or the creeks that flow into these tidal rivers, are flowing quite comfortably and frankly flowing good up until about June or July. The thing is that as long as the water flows, I'm not inviting anybody to go down the Brazos River when it's flowing higher than normal or flowing well and saying, go get you a big mug of the Brazos River water and down it. But because the Brazos River water, or for that matter, any water, assuming it's in its more or less natural state, you don't have runoffs and all that bad stuff coming into it. Bad stuff in the sense like man-made chemicals like you'd see in the Brazos River bottom or something of that nature. The thing is that rivers are actually self-cleaning. As long as the flow is high enough, they're self-cleaning, and frankly, all things considered, relatively safe. Again, I'm not suggesting anybody go down there and go get a mug of the bubbly out of the Colorado or the San Jacinto around Houston. But the thing is that it's relatively safe as long as the flow's high. But if the flow slows down, and if you live around San Marcos, people go to Texas State, when the flow on the San Marcos River, which is a spring-fed river, slows down, they shut down the river because the bacterium gets too high. So the problem was they don't know that. Bacteria and the idea of germ theory and all that sort of stuff doesn't come into vogue. It doesn't become confirmed until the mid to late 19th century. I mean, we're still, let me think a second, about 200 to 300 years away, 200 years away from germ theory. So we're still in primitive times for medicine, to be clear about that. But anyways, in Virginia, they're going to drink the water where they get their hands on it. And the water was bad. It slowed down, and it was bad for in those months, basically, July to October. And so lots and lots of waterborne diseases are going to be brought up and brought out, the one of which is cholera, cholera. Cholera is one of the great killers of mankind regardless of geography. It's essentially drinking diseased or bad water. It's a bacterium, as I recall. But anyways, cholera or other waterborne diseases carried away many a cavalier and many a slave and many a servant. It was not a respecter of station and caste in life. So there was always, when you talk about the Cavaliers, there was always kind of this pallor or pall hanging over their head of, are we going to survive? Are we going to make it? How's this going to work out? And so forth and so on. Well, anyways, you kind of got a little fatalistic in a sense. You kind of had to prepare for the future. You kind of whistled at, some will whistle past the proverbial graveyard. But in Cavalier, Virginia, it was not uncommon to see families or communities get ravaged by outbreaks in what they called the sick season from July to October. And they get ravaged by these waterborne outbreaks that would kill mom and maybe dad, or maybe dad and not mom, but oftentimes it was one. But sometimes some families were harmed by this and both got killed. You'll read about this in the public records there in Virginia about a mother and a father dying and what happens next, because maybe they were the only family in the neighborhood. And by the way, I shouldn't say this earlier, but eventually you're going to start to balance out the male-female relationship in Cavalier, Virginia. More and more women are going to be born, and more women are going to be traveling across the ocean to come to Virginia Society, Virginia. So what do you do with the kids? So you're going to have a lot of adoptions, and a lot of these adoptions are not legal in the sense that you go out, and they're not legal in the sense that you go to a judge or anything of that nature, but kind of these understood arrangements between families that if we don't make it through the sixth season, you're going to watch my kids until they get old enough to take over the plantation or the ranch or the farm, not the ranch, but the farm. So you'll have a lot of informal adoptions in there. And, it also, of course, with death so prominent and close, and really what you're going to look at is that how do they handle the issue of death and dying? The issue of death and dying is a kind of a interesting mindset. For the Puritans, they're stoical until they start to mourn amongst themselves, and then the alcohol comes out. William Byrd, I remember one excerpt from his diary. This would have been about 1720 or 1730 territory. Byrd was sitting at a dinner table there in the governor's mansion with one of his friends, and his friend evidently rolled his eyes back in his head, had a heart attack, and fell out dead, something of that effect. And they carried the man out, and Byrd goes back and finishes his meal and, says nothing about it the rest of the day by people who were also there at the table. We kind of can piece this story together. But that night, Byrd gushes into his diary about the vapor of life idea that you see in the book of James in the New Testament and other places. The idea of life is short and it's you don't know how long you have. All those sorts of things there. And so he gushed in his diary. He prayed fervently with zeal and earnestness. And he even noted in his diary, and this would have been after his wife had died, Governor Byrd basically said, I told one of his servants had become his mistress, essentially, may have been a slave, actually, who'd become his mistress. Basically, I think it was a servant, but it doesn't matter. He turned her away and said, go away. No, I won't do that. And that holds up for about a month or two. And then you start seeing in that diary, he forgot his prayers. And the girlfriends start returning. But in that diary, in that immediate outpath, he is on the one hand stoical, and then he just kind of in a private manner gushes into his written words. You see that quite a bit with him. They are not only, they handle death that way, but their rearing of children is also going to be different from the Cavaliers. The Cavaliers reared their girls and boys in distinct girl-boy fashion, but they also have kind of that equality mindset that I talked about before. They're not Quakers, but compared to the Cavaliers, they're enlightened. The Cavaliers, they raised their boys to be warriors, to be aggressive, to be conquistadors almost. Whether that was on the battlefield or in the bedroom. You see a lot of that in the warrior mentality of the Cavaliers. In addition to that, they also raised their boys to be chivalrous and restrained and to be courteous and all those sorts of things. And if you think about it, those are almost two diametrically opposite things. On the one hand, go be aggressive, be a warrior, go on the attack. Go get what you want and bring it home, as it were. Yet on the other hand, especially toward women, you're supposed to be restrained and you don't do that sort of thing. You don't be overly aggressive. You're supposed to open the proverbial opening of the door, courteous, and on I can go. But the thing is that those two don't play together. And one historian has referred to this relationship as kind of the coiled spring relationship between the aggressiveness on the one hand and the restraint on the other. The Cavalier male was a coiled spring. The woman, on the other hand, is taught not to be aggressive, though at times she becomes exactly that. Like I said, the Carter example I think of very readily, and there are others too. But she is taught very much a domestic life, and she is not considered, she would be educated, but nothing like her husband if education was valuable to the family, which brings us up to something else. Education is not always the most valuable thing. They don't believe in reading for the sake of reading, especially the Bible sort of idea that the Puritans had. So their relationship with education was far more checkered than it was with the Puritans. And if you were a family that valued education, you would send your kid to a private school, or tutors would come and teach at the house. That was not uncommon. And so they would rear their children in that sort of manner. To that point, one of the things that's worth noting about the Cavalier males is that they, and the Cavalier society, was that they were big on, games. Whereas the Puritans had a special enmity in their heart for games. They hated, especially gambling. I should be more precise now. They hated gambling. Games, the Puritans could allow, like baseball. As long as it wasn't on Sunday, they'd allow it. But the Cavaliers had no such hang-ups. They gambled on seemingly anything that could move. And when we talk about the Cavaliers, they were big into cockfighting. They were big into horse racing and so forth. Horse racing, famously George Washington, who himself is a very famous Cavalier. The thing that's unique about him is that he was not the womanizer that many of his peers were. He was the warrior, but he was never the womanizer. That was always, I've thought very highly of him on many accounts. That's one of them. But the fact of the matter is that so you have Washington there as an example, but he owned horses. He loved horse racing. He was an excellent horseman. He knew it well. So that would be one thing. And so you'd have betting on Sundays on horse races. Number two, you have cockfights, and perhaps maybe one or two of you have been to a cockfight who are watching this. Every student I've ever had who has gone to a cockfight said it is a strange and exciting experience, whether it was in Mexico, Louisiana, or somewhere quietly in Texas. The fact of the matter is, if you don't know anything about cockfighting is where you take two roosters, and there's not much training involved in the sense that roosters either know how to fight or they don't. You take two roosters, you put what are called gaffs on the back of their spurs. Basically, it's a razor blade, a curved razor blade that's on their spur, and these roosters know this, and they're trying to spur their enemy, their opponent in the ring. And so you'll get all these different bets, some of which who's going to win, how long it's going to last, all that sort of fun stuff there. And over the years, they've adjusted the gaffs. Sometimes they're still the traditional curved hook. Other times it's more like a razor blade where they swing it, and it's a blood sport, to use a term. It is clearly a blood sport. But the one I will tell here, and this was a Cavalier preference, it was kind of the coming out party for the boys about 15, 16 years old territory, it's called the gander pull. The gander pull. Now, what is a gander? It is a male goose. And a male goose, and by the way, geese are mean creatures. They may end up being good to eat. They are beautiful in their own right, I guess, but they are some mean creatures. And so I've never felt too sorry for the geese, as they attacked me when I was about my daughter's age, maybe even 3 years old. These geese in San Antonio were in my grandparents' neighbor's yard, and they'd gotten out of their pen. They jumped the fence and they attacked me and started biting me and attacking me, and so I've never felt sorry for telling this story. Well, anyways, these old male ganders, that's who they'd pick, an old male gander that was past his prime. They would grease him up and hang him upside down, and they'd grease his neck real good with lard. And so, say on a Sunday afternoon after church was done over there at the Anglican church, and the Anglican church services were never as long or never as involved as the Puritan operation. And so what these geese would do, they hang these ganders upside down. And the gander, if you can imagine, is squawking, rah, 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 doing it. And these young men dressed in their Sunday finest and on their best horse, they'd go riding by at a gallop, and they're trying to rip the head of the gander off. Again, this is a blood sport. But that grease or that lard on the neck makes the grease slick, and so their hand slips through. Well, they keep riding by, and they ride by, and occasionally, it happened more often than you might care to admit, but a kid would reach out and grab it real good and real hard, but the head wasn't ready to come away, and he'd get jerked out of the saddle and sometimes break his own neck trying to rip the head off of a gander. Well, eventually, however, the head does come away, and the boy who has that is the winner in the town and had it. And even the Anglican minister himself or the Anglican rector would sometimes be holding the money bag on all the bets that had been made. Who's going to win, who's the better character, and so forth. All of which is to say this is big stuff and big times for them. By the way, the kids, or rather the society, but it affected the kids especially, but the society was big on dancing. The Puritans would have crushed dancing with a righteous fury, but not the Cavaliers. They, in fact, would hire tutors, and some of you may have grown up by going to a cotillion or some sort of dance school as a kid. Maybe you were kind of in a debutante society, but you learned how to dance as a kid, and your mom and dad paid good money every month to go to the junior league or wherever it was, the country club, and learn how to dance formally. But they would hire tutors that would come through, and they would teach those kids how to dance for 8 hours on a Sunday, or rather on a Saturday, and then maybe again on the Sunday afternoon. George Washington, back to him as a famous Cavalier, was a famous dancer. He had basically his, I would almost call them twinkle toes, but at the same time, it was a known fact that Washington loved to dance, and not with women who were his wife. He never cheated on Martha, but Washington danced, and it was kind of a way he handled the politics of the Revolutionary War. He was able to spread goodwill by the fact that he would dance with various and sundry women, and they would come up to him. And it was said that sometimes Washington had women lined up around the block to dance with him. But dancing and gaming, and oh, by the way, they loved to waste time. Oh, they wasted time like it was going out of style. Put off today what you can do tomorrow was their mantra, it seemed like. Take a nap in the afternoon when you maybe ought to be pushing some paper. Oh, yeah. The Puritans, got to work hard. The Puritan work ethic. You got to work hard not just for man, but also for God. The Cavaliers, on the other hand, they're like, yeah, I'm going to take a nap. And so some of you are thinking, well, these are my guys. I like to dance. I like to watch horses race. I like to take a nap. These are my fellows. I love seafood. That's them. But for all intents and purposes, they're going to be the dominant force. These Cavaliers will be. They will be the dominant force in Cavalier Virginia society for 130 to 150 years, maybe a little longer. You will find their descendants making waves in American history in, say, the American Civil War. Robert E. Lee is married into the Custis family, the Carter family, all those families in the neck of Virginia, as they called it at times as well. He was in that lineage. But the Tidewater of Virginia will be not only home to Washington, but will also dominate Virginia society and really outpunch its weight, outpunch its numbers. They will dominate it compared to, say, the Piedmont, which is the western part of Virginia where all the mountains are, where Charlottesville, Virginia, and the University of Virginia resides. So that's all there. And these guys are some of the more important individuals in North America and in Virginia, of course. And that's a good place to stop for this installment.